Okay, I hope everyone had a good bite to eat, has had a chance to wander a few minutes. We're going to get going to talk about patient engagement and research, because as we're talking about new therapies, the always question is, well, what's next? And the only thing about what's next is that research continues on this, and it's more than just kind of participating in research. There's all different ways that people can participate in different phases. So that's the purpose of having a few minutes to hear today. We're going to start off with, could you fix the slide? We're going to start off with Dr. Janice Bulow. She is the Vice President for Programs and Research in the Epilepsy Foundation. She started off as an epilepsy nurse specialist and has been an instructor at nursing schools, and now we're lucky to have her at the Epilepsy Foundation. She's going to start by talking about the Rare Epilepsy Network. Following that, I'm going to be having Dr. Brandy Fuhrman. She's a PhD from the National Institute of Neurological Diseases and Stroke at the NIH. She's a director of some of the epilepsy research there. So she's going to talk about some of the variety of ways that people can become engaged. Dr. Bulow?
Hi, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch, and thanks for coming. This has been a lot of fun. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about, do I change my own slides? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about what it looks like for patient engagement, and I'm going to give you the example that we have from the Epilepsy Foundation. And the example we have is called the Rare Epilepsy Network, and so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about that. And just sort of give you an overview about how patient engagement and research has really sort of changed the face of how we're doing research in this particular project. So we have what's called the Rare Epilepsy Network, and I'm the PI on that, the principal investigator, and Barbara Kroner, who is a senior research epidemiologist from Research Triangle Institute, and who is with us here today, so she might chime in if she has anything really smart to say, and then, or smarter than what I'm saying, which probably wouldn't be that hard. And then Dr. Dale Hestorfer. But in general, what you need to know is that the Rare Epilepsy Network was an initiative that is created by and for patients and their families with rare epilepsies. And so the Rare Epilepsy Network was funded by an organization called PCORI. That's the acronym for Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and it is a federally funded foundation, essentially, that grew out of the Health Reform Act. And the beauty of PCORI is that it is truly about patient-centered outcomes. And so they've done a lot of different kinds of projects, but what you need to know about it is that at PCORI, they have patients who are a part of the review panel. They have patients on their advisory boards. So there's a lot of patient-driven activities at this PCORI Institute. So the grant that we are a part of is a program that is actually huge, and it's made up of 18 smaller groups, which we are one of, and they're called patient-powered research networks. And so it is typically, mostly what it is just like ours, they are small little groups or smaller groups that represent mostly a disease entity is what it's looking like. So there's 18 of these smaller groups. But then also, as part of this very large research project, there's the Clinical Data Research Network, and those are systems organizations, so it's multiple hospital systems working together. The beauty of this idea is building systems of research where there could be commonalities overlapping between disease processes, but also there's a way to identify and look across organizations and these different groups to really essentially increase the power of research. But it's all patient-driven. So the Rare Epilepsy Network was an initiative that was really created by patients and their families, and it was designed to provide patients and their families an opportunity to participate in research. So you can see what the goals are. It's patient-centered and patient-driven, and the goal is to improve lives and quality of care of people with rare epilepsies. But what happened was the call for this research grant came out, and Vision 2020, which is an organization that grew out of the Institute of Medicine's report, Vision 2020 is made up of multiple smaller organizations. So the Dravet Institute, Lennox-Gastaut, a Cardi Foundation, so multiple smaller organizations, and the Epilepsy Foundation is part of it, and the Cure is part of it, and American Epilepsy Society is part of it, so it's this multiple organizations. But these smaller groups like Dravet and Acardi decided that they wanted to go for this patient-powered research network. And so what they did was they recruited us. They recruited the Epilepsy Foundation, they recruited Dr. Kroner, they recruited Dr. Hesdorfer, and brought us in to build this research program. So they drove patients or family members, drove the development of the program, the proposal. They have been actively involved in every aspect of this project. And these are the initial 7. We're up to 10 now, I think, or maybe 11. Can't remember. But these were the original 7 groups, the rare epilepsy disorders, that really drove the initiation of this project. And so I'll explain to you in just a few minutes what it looks like, but I just want you to see the patient engagement in this research process. And it's very important because patients are deciding what kinds of questions we should be asking. Patients are driving, they're beginning to drive what IRBs are going to look like and what kinds of IRB applications we have to do and what informed consent is going to look like. So it's kind of changing the face of what research might be looking like. So we have a governing board which is made up of the executive committee, and that would be Barbara, Dale, and myself, and a representative from these small organizations. And then there's the steering committee that is made up of one member of each one of these organizations. And these are the groups that make all of the decisions about what's going to happen in this activity. And then we have working groups that look at things like recruitment and engagement, research topics, privacy and sharing, etc. So all of these groups are involved in all of these activities. What we're building is a database. And the database is, it consists of patient-related outcomes or patient-related outcomes that are important to the people who are helping us to build this database. And so the database is being built at Research Triangle Institute. We are going to use NIH's common data elements, and so NIH has come up with sort of identified questions that if we use the same set of questions across all studies, then we can begin to compare studies so that we can get better and more important data. But we're going to be, PCORI is also identifying their own data elements. So, and the other important key piece to this is that we probably, sometime in the future, will be importing electronic health records. So when you go to the doctor, you have health records that are filled out. And we would be putting this in only with patients' permission, so these informations would go in. And the reason this is important is because we'll be able to take all of this data across these rare epilepsies. Now remember, I mean, sometimes there's only you know, there's maybe 200 or 300 patients in each one of these rare groups. And so if we just did it with one group, we wouldn't have enough data. But across all of these rare epilepsies, we're going to begin to gather enough data to get important information. So these are some of the features of the Rare Epilepsy Network. In the future, we're going to be working on continued funding from PCORI, and we're going to be building a sustainability plan that, from the Epilepsy Foundation that will look like a Rare Epilepsy Institute, which will have education, social networking, and other research. And then we hope to endow that and partner with all the relevant organizations in that endeavor. So in conclusion, the Rare Epilepsy Network project is critically important for patients and their family, and it's critically important because it's patient and family driven, and that it's going to provide data to do research in a time frame that's useful to patients and families. We're going to be able to answer questions we weren't able to answer before. I actually think that PCORI and this particular project, which is called PCORNet, is visionary. It is the first time that we've been able to begin to look across systems in a patient-driven manner that will increase the ability for systems to talk to one another and the potential for more research opportunities. And by the way, if you would look at the kind of research they're doing overseas, because they already have these systems in place broadly across countries, especially in like in Sweden, they can do all of this kind of important research and answer these questions, which we haven't been able to really do here. But I just wanted to say one last quick thing, and that is that research isn't important if it's not about patients and their families. If it doesn't have some relevance to the people that we are trying to do the research for. Research has to be patient-driven. It can't be researcher-driven. Now, I'm not saying that researchers shouldn't have a huge key piece in that, because they get the process, and it's not an easy process, it's really hard. But what I'm saying is the patients and their families always have to be at the center of everything we do and everything that we're thinking about when we're doing research. And so the only way we can do that is to continuously engage people like you, to ask questions, to come forward, to talk about. So I just want to put that in your head, because it's critical. And this is one way that it can happen, and I'm done. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buelow. Dr. Furman? Slides for Dr. Furman?
Thank you. So Jan, that was a perfect introduction to what I'd like to talk about, which is what are the tools that we have available to get people involved, to get patients and their families, people with epilepsy involved in research in a systematic way across the whole process. So those are not my slides. Those are my slides. Thank you. And I have to say, at this point in the program, the title of my talk seems really silly, because I think everybody in this room by now can answer the question about why clinical research matters. And I think that, we've heard clearly the pieces of the pipeline that are moving forward today are not going to advance into the marketplace, into your hands, unless we can complete those clinical research studies. And that's why they're so critically important. I work at the National Institutes of Health in the Neurology Department, Neurology Institute, and we spend about $130 million in the last year on epilepsy research. That's research from the very basic end of the spectrum, trying to understand how those ion channels work and how we might manipulate them and turn those targets into therapies, into translational research to try to move basic science findings into the realm of clinical studies and clinical research. And we also support clinical trials, large phase 3 kinds of studies comparing the effects of different available medications, testing new approaches to treating seizures and their consequences. And we are joined in this funding by money coming from pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, device companies, all being poured into funds for clinical research, clinical trials, to try to get answers to these questions. But again, as I said, none of that matters unless we have partners from the community of people with epilepsy who will engage with us in those clinical research projects to get the answers we need. So how many people in the audience have participated in a clinical research project? Thank you. Thank you. And my goal is to, if we can, get that number to 100%. And not just 100% in this room, but 100% of people with epilepsy, caregivers, considering how they might get involved in clinical research studies or in the clinical research process. Because there are more than one way, there's more than one way to get involved in a research study beyond enrollment. A study develops from idea all the way through, the final publication, the paper, and the implementation into clinical practice. And there are places all along that process where the voice of people with epilepsy can have a huge impact. So I want to go through a few of those places with you. Just to be clear, we're not only talking about clinical trials. Clinical trials are critically important to get new therapies to the marketplace, but observational studies, simply observing what happens over time, given one kind of intervention or another, given one genetic composition or another, can be really important to helping to understand how to tackle this problem. And so observational studies are another way that you can contribute to the knowledge we have about epilepsy. NIH has put together a really nice set of web pages to give information about clinical research and about clinical trials. If you are interested in learning more about the process and the questions to ask before you get involved, I would suggest that you take a look at that website. And so I have to give you this quick list. I actually stole this from a friend of mine at NINDS who is the recruitment specialist. And she puts this list at the bottom of every email message that she sends. And I think it's priceless because it reminds us of so many of the therapies and approaches that we almost take for granted at this point that have only come to us because people were willing to enroll in research studies to find out these answers. So, you have to thank research if you and everyone you know has never had smallpox. Think about that. And there are many others on this list that I think are priceless. But that's the kind of attitude that I think we need to start to bring to clinical research in epilepsy, that it's a partnership between the scientists, the funders, and the community of people with epilepsy to get these answers out there. So this is the long version of the slide, so I'll skip through these just but the idea was to help give an example of how clinical research and basic research and observational studies can all work together to help us get to new answers. And if anybody's interested in some of these, I'd be happy to talk with you after the session. So how can you get involved? The middle circle is a description of how a clinical research project evolves. So someone has an idea, they develop that idea into a protocol, they determine which patients and which participants will need to be part of this study in order to answer this question. That's the selection arrow. They then go out and try to recruit people to participate in the study. And I can tell you from my experience in working with clinical trials and from what I have heard from others in the audience who are part of this process, it can be extremely difficult to recruit people into clinical trials. What that means is the time of the trial gets longer, the cost of the trial gets bigger, the perceived difficulty in answering a question in an epilepsy population gets harder. So it just sets the bar that much higher for funders and pharmaceutical companies, device companies, to want to invest in new therapies in this area. Because if they think they can enroll in clinical trials to answer the question, their money has gone to waste. So as part of that process, then, you actually have to implement the trial. You have to not only enroll people in the trial, but you have to convince them to stay in the trial. You have to retain them so that you can collect the data points that you need to answer your question. And for some studies, that period of time can be years. And so making the commitment to be part of a clinical study is a serious one. People should think real long and hard about whether they can maintain it. But once you're enrolled in a clinical trial, you're part of that team. You're part of the team that's needed to answer the question. And it's critically important. So I'm going to go quickly into some of the other ways that you can get involved in the clinical research process. So I've put around the outside of this circle a couple points, which is we would love to have more engagement of people with epilepsy and their family members in the review of ideas for clinical research. NINDS has set up a clinical research network called NeuroNext, and one of the requirements of that NeuroNext network, in order to do a project through that network, you have to have a representative of the disease community as part of your design team. And that's one way that we're trying to increase the significance of the kinds of projects we choose to fund and choose to do. There's a role for people in the community to go out and educate other people about what clinical research is, why it's important, how you can get involved, and I think that's a piece that we could really do some important work, the education of the entire community. There are committees that Dr. Bulow mentioned, excuse me, institutional review committees that approve a protocol to go forward. They look at the risks and the benefits of the proposed study, and they make a decision about whether that study can go forward or not. Every IRB is required to have a member of a patient community as part of that review group. That's one place where you can get involved in making a decision about whether the risks and benefits of a particular project are appropriate, whether the potential benefit is worth the risk that we think might be inherent. So once a study is started, we also have committees called data and safety monitoring boards. There again is a place where a patient representative, person with epilepsy or family member can sit on that committee and help monitor the safety and the effect of the treatment as it's going on in the clinical trial. It's, I think, a critically important role. We haven't used people with epilepsy in that role enough, and we would love to be able to incorporate more of you on our data and safety monitoring boards. So then finally, once the study's completed, once we have an answer, I think there's a role for folks to really help us get that education out there, help us transmit what is a clinical research finding into clinical practice. And so those are a few examples of places where I think we need partnership between the community of people with epilepsy, the research community, and the funders. We would love to have your participation. So I stuck my contact information. Oh, and just before we leave, I want to mention a tool to help you identify trials that you might be eligible to participate in. So this is a new tool developed by a very broad collection of voluntary organizations to help make it easier for people with epilepsy to find a clinical trial that they might want to participate in. And if you're interested in any of those other opportunities I talked about, institutional review boards, data safety monitoring boards, being part of a design team for a clinical project, please contact me. I'm happy to talk with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I have that? Sorry. All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite Catherine Keeney up from the Epilepsy Foundation of Northern California. Come right up here. All right. I'm not going to do
Northern California.
All right. She's gonna, I want to thank her very much and her affiliate for helping to kind of get the word out to everybody here and for being here to support everybody with epilepsy in Northern California. So we want to make sure everyone knows about the resources here. So she's going to take a couple minutes to talk to them.
And thank you, National, for allowing us this time, and we're thrilled to have you, everyone here in San Francisco. So raise your hand if you live in the area between Fresno, Monterey, and the Oregon border. We have? Okay, quite a few people. So I just have to say, your affiliate is there to help you and to provide hands-on support in your area. So if you're not in our area, please contact the affiliate in your area. Okay, I was going to say our office is 6 blocks from here. I want to tell you something. My motto is to talk about it. I have epilepsy. I got it when I was 48. I got it 10 years ago. Actually, it was 12 years ago. For the first 10 years, I knew 3 people that had epilepsy. Okay, I was one of them. So, because I was afraid to talk to people about it. And when I started working with the Epilepsy Foundation, I found, obviously, all these people, and I think that's one of our jobs is to normalize epilepsy, to teach seizure recognition and first aid, and to get people to realize, yeah, people can have seizures and it's no big deal. It doesn't mean I should, fire them from their job. One of our big advocates is Tony Coelho. He's from the Central Valley here in California. He's one of 3 authors of the ADA. So we have some good support behind us. Just like the motto on the new logo for the Epilepsy Foundation, it's "We're Stronger Together." And so if you're in Northern California, please come with us. We have some wonderful volunteers here. And in fact, I've got a couple sitting in the room. Hi, Charlie. And a couple out front. Here's our purpose. Our purpose is to help patients and families, as I said, to teach seizure recognition and first aid, to support research. We do advocacy in the Capitol, and we have a wonderful summer camp, and we're now going to be starting a new basketball summer camp. I just got a volunteer who's going to organize it today. Yay! And our goal is that every physician, when they see a patient who is first diagnosed with epilepsy or seizures, they should be giving them information about the Epilepsy Foundation of Northern California. So I just want to say thank you. I hope you're having a little fun while you're here, too. It's a great city, and appreciate the Epilepsy Foundation giving us a chance to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Dr. Bulow, Dr. Fuhrman. We're getting ready for the afternoon, the rest of the afternoon here. On this slide, what you'll see now is also the web address if you're from the greater Los Angeles area or from San Diego. So please write those down or go to epilepsy.com and you can click on Find an Affiliate and find the closest Epilepsy Foundation affiliate wherever you live. And that's for our internet audience too. Really connect with them. I'd like the next panel that's talking about surgery and devices and when medicines don't work to please come up here. And while they're coming up, I want to introduce Patricia Dean. Pat is an epilepsy nurse practitioner, works with children and families at Miami Children's Hospital in their Brain Institute. She's been one of my epilepsy colleagues for a few years. Knows her work here. So she's going to be the moderator of our session as we start looking at other advances. So,
You want us to sit up here through all the talks?
yes, actually. Hold on. Could you put on the first slide for the introductions here?
I didn't show up just at the time of my talk.
Okay, and I have been giving my marching orders that I am to keep the time. So, anyway, I am very happy to be in San Francisco. I wish I was outside, but I'm happy to be in here with you. Anyway, this session is on surgery and devices. So we have a number of different speakers and different perspectives. And we are going to start with Lisa. Let me get my glasses on. Maybe with my glasses. I don't know. Okay. Fair enough. Oh, yes, I do. All right. Lisa Moore, Lisa Moss, who is the, let me see, she's going to give us a, right here. Oh, thank you. All right, Lisa Moss, first of all, her most important position is the mother of Evan, who lives with tuberous sclerosis. She's the co-founder of SeizureTracker.com, and she's the director of donor relations at the TS Alliance. So she's going to give us the personal perspective.
Thank you. How do I move the slides? Will they just move? Is there a green arrow? I don't see a green arrow. I don't see a green arrow. I'll just start talking. There's.
This.
Oh, thank you. Okay, that helps. Thank you very much. Sorry, a little technical difficulty. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really honored to be here to share our personal story and our journey with epilepsy. My son, Evan Moss, is pictured here, and he really is has changed my life in ways I would have never expected. Before we had Evan, I have a degree in photography. I was a photo editor, and now 10 years into his life, I really live my life as a full-time advocate, working with families with Seizure Tracker and trying to help people with TSC through the TS Alliance, and it's really because of him. And I know it's really interesting to me because there's times when things are really hard with living with seizures in our household, and it's you never really know how it's going to go. It's different year from year, and sometimes it really brings me down, as I'm sure everybody can relate. And Evan is this amazing kid. He's spirited and funny and really upbeat. He's never met a stranger in his life. He's very sociable, and he has the most positive attitude of anybody I know. And with everything he's gone through, he still maintains this. And so when things aren't really going well in our house, I'm sort of overwhelmed because of a bad seizure or something. I sort of look at Evan and I try to take his lead because he knows how to live with this much better than I do, many times. So Evan came into this world, and not long after this photo was taken, he started having seizures. This was his very first day of life, and that's my daughter kissing him. That was the first thing she did when she met him, and she just jumped up and gave him a big kiss, and it really set the tone for their relationship. He started having seizures pretty much right away. They were simple partial seizures, and we went to our doctor and got referred to a neurologist who did some testing, EEG, MRI, and found a mass. He was diagnosed with cortical dysplasia, and she said, "Don't worry. This could be, no big deal. Here's some medicine, we'll monitor it, and you're on your way." So we left, and a year later, we had a follow-up MRI and found that he had 3 masses, and actually, ultimately 4. He was born with all 4 of them, but his brain wasn't developed enough to be able to identify them all at the time. So as we got subsequent MRIs, they were able to see them all, and they started suspecting that he had tuberous sclerosis complex, or TSC for short. And for those of you who don't know, it causes tumors to grow in vital organs. It can affect the brain, eyes, skin, kidneys, lungs, heart, pretty much any organ. I heard someone say anywhere you have a cell, you could grow a tumor, and that's pretty much true. It's the leading known genetic cause for epilepsy and autism. And it's a variable disease. People don't have all of these problems and all of these symptoms. It's different for everyone. So for Evan, our biggest challenge has always been epilepsy. He went through many, many different medications, lots of testing, trying to figure out what was going to be the best thing for him. And my husband and I really started looking at solutions. How do we find solutions? You know, our first attempts at solutions were medications. They weren't that successful in our situation. And we were trying to figure out, how do you manage the constant changes with increasing one medication as you go on to it, decreasing another, and then if there's success or if there's challenges, figuring out which one is giving you a good result, which one's giving you a bad result. And we were just looking for ways that we could help Evan and sort all of this out. So we were given this piece of paper, and this is to track. It's 365 boxes on this piece of paper. It's to track a year's worth of seizures. Well, Evan was having, multiple seizures every day, and he was on multiple medications, and clearly this is not an effective way to do this. So we were looking at a way that we could solve this so we could see, medications aren't working. People are talking about brain surgery. Can we avoid brain surgery? Can we find something that'll give a 20% increase in effectiveness? We launched Seizure Tracker, as was mentioned, and as a free resource to families. So we found it to help ourselves and then put it out there to hopefully help other people. And we're able to produce images like this to show our physicians, to really show better if the drugs are working or not working. And now it's also available mobily, so we can record seizures live video as they're happening, time them, and have it all sync up to the website. We don't have to do those miserable paper products anymore to try to keep track of everything. But with Evan, and I say this because we had brain surgery, and we actually launched the website from NYU Hospital. We were there for a month in the ICU going through brain surgery, and that's where we launched Seizure Tracker. It's such a part, everything is such a part of our story, and everything focuses around Evan. He was there for, it was a series of 3 surgeries, 1 week apart, to do the full surgery. They removed 3 tumors, and it was such a daunting thing to go through. You think you've prepared for it. You read, you talk to families to find out what they deal with preparing for brain surgery, and you think you've prepared for it, and then you walk through the door of the hospital and you just check your lives at the door. It challenges you in ways you'll never know. Our family really had a crazy experience there, but ultimately we knew that it was the right choice for him because he had started to really decline. He was losing weight, he was zoned out, he had bags under his eyes, he looked sickly, and he wasn't really smiling anymore. So we knew that this was the choice we made, the right choice to make. He left the hospital seizure-free. It was the first time he'd been seizure-free in the longest time, since he was really, really little. But because of where the tumors were, it wasn't without some challenges afterwards. He was not left with a permanent deficit, but when we left the hospital, he took 6 steps and was very wobbly. He could not, if we set him down on the floor, he could not stand up from a seated position. He didn't know how to crawl anymore. He couldn't go upstairs or run or ride his bike. And so he had to go through all of these basic baby milestones all over again. And he did this through very rigorous physical therapy 3 times a week. And everything was about playing, everything was about fun, and he was able to really astound his doctors and his physical therapists, and 9 months later he was rock climbing. So it was just a really phenomenal thing to witness and be part of. I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about our daughter Aria. Aria and Evan are very close. She's one of his strongest supporters. She's become an advocate in her own right. She's doing public speaking. She talked to the principal at her school to do an epilepsy awareness day on Purple Day, and the whole school, got involved and wore purple. And she spoke on the little news thing they have at the school. And it's been really amazing to watch her and how she's focusing this experience in our home. I will say that sometimes we worry more about Aria than Evan and how this life is impacting her. I've heard again and again from families with older kids that you really have to pay attention to the siblings, and we've taken that to heart, and hopefully we're not screwing her up too bad. We're really trying to make sure that we keep the focus on her as well and her needs. And in our most recent search for solutions, Evan has started having seizures again. He was seizure-free for a couple years. I don't want to say they came back because we got a totally different seizure type, but now he's having seizures that happen in his sleep, and they're complex partial clusters that go to status. They last upwards of 10 minutes. We're always giving rescue meds, and he has one every 10 days. So it's still serious, and our most recent solution was a service dog, and this is Evan and Mindy, and she's trained as a seizure response dog, and she also helps with anxiety issues, anything, she's with him all the time, and she's been a really great four-legged addition to our family. She goes to school with Evan. She's been embraced by our school system, which is phenomenal. I know a lot of families really struggle with that. They're inseparable. She'll put up with pretty much anything. And we just feel very fortunate to have this new solution. And what's next on the horizon, we don't really know yet. We're looking at a potential surgery again. We've talked about visual aids, we've talked about neuropace, we've talked about CBD. What's next, we don't know, but we're definitely in that searching period for what the next solution is. And I came across this quote that I really liked, and I feel like it's so apropos for what our lives are like. Life's not about waiting for the storm to pass, it's about learning to dance in the rain. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That was truly a wonderful patient perspective, and now we're going to have kind of the physician perspective on how physicians come to the decision on how to treat patients with the severe epilepsy. So our next speaker is Dr. Paul Garcia. He's a professor of clinical neurology from the University of California in San Francisco, and he's going to talk about what to do when medicines aren't working.
Thanks, and that was just such a fantastic lead-in to this session, and it really gets to the point of how personal this is as opposed to the way we kind of sometimes like to want to make, we want to think that we can figure this all out, is a person refractory by looking at charts or whatever, and it really ends up being a very personal thing. So when I started fellowship, this is a slide that I had in my collection, and I had to remake it because when I did my fellowship, we actually had slides that were slides. And now, I didn't have anything in PowerPoint. But I think this points out exactly why it's so much more important to think of the personal. This is what we sort of said, well, this is what our goal should be when we come into treating a person who has seizures. No seizures, no side effects. That's really simple. That sounds great. But how realistic is it? Well, for the longest time, doctors couldn't even agree on how realistic this was. When you talk to community neurologists, they say, well, actually, most of my patients have good seizure control. I think most people have good seizure control. The reason you doctors at the epilepsy centers think that no one has good seizure control is because that's the only people that go to see you there, right? So it's, what you get to see a very biased you have a very biased perspective. And we were finally able to answer that to in a better way when you had a couple of researchers from Glasgow, Scotland, look at all the people in an area. So they looked at all the people that came in who just started having seizures for the first time. And they looked at how their seizure control was when they had the first medicine added on. If that didn't work, then when the next medicine was tried. And they found that, in fact, it wasn't all as great as we thought. It turns out that when they had almost close to 500 people come in, and these are just all comers, not people that had been referred into the epilepsy center because they were the epilepsy center. They were it for the whole city. And they had over half of the people that started the first medicine continued to have seizures. When that group of people, got treated, and you looked at how many people overall had stopped having seizures, well, it was up to about 60% had stopped having seizures, but 40% still had seizures after the first 2 medicines had been tried. And then when you tried another medicine or combination of medicines, it was down to you got a whole nother 4%, and in fact, 36% were still having seizures. So you can see that there's just diminishing returns, and that's something that's already been talked about, and that's why you can get the situation where people get up to having their 9th medicine and seizures are persisting. So I think that this slide is kind of, for so many people, unrealistic, and what it boils down to is over half of people just aren't so fortunate to be in this good situation where they have no seizures and no side effects. So then questions arise, and you may have heard all these kinds of questions. You may have had these questions. Are my seizures controlled? Are my seizures refractory? I think these things depend on who you talk to. Sometimes the person says, well, I talked to my doctor and they said that my seizures are controlled. Or somebody says, well, I feel like my seizures are controlled because they were better than they were before I started taking medicines, which is hopefully true. But still, I think controlled ends up being in the eye of the beholder, and that's why personal stories like the entry story here are just so important. What are breakthrough seizures? Is that just a word that doctors make up? Breakthrough seizures seem like maybe they're just seizures, right? I don't know what a breakthrough seizure is because it seems like it's just a seizure and it can make you fall down just the same way that a regular seizure can, and it interferes with your life just as much as well. So why do I have somebody on this side of the room who's having 3 seizures a month who says, well, you know what, I think my seizures are pretty controlled. I'm okay here. Why would you ever talk to me about surgery? And somebody on this side of the room who has 3 seizures a month who says, oh man, this is really affecting my life. I hate this. My seizures are not controlled. Don't tell me my seizures are controlled. Well, I think it's because there are a lot of factors that go into this, and some of them are personal and just the way people think about the world, but some of them are that you can't just sort of look at the chart and sort of say, are there seizures? You have to really think, are all seizures equal? Are some seizures different from each other in how they affect a person and how they affect a person's life? And how might that be? Well, I think the first thing we can do is just ask a real basic question. How do the seizures affect my health? How do they affect my life? And as far as the side effects that come from trying to treat the seizures, can I maintain seizure control without the side effects? And if not, are the side effects acceptable? Is it something that I can live with? What are some seizure factors that might change your mind about how controlled a person's epilepsy is? Well, I think one thing that maybe patients don't think about sometimes as much as doctors think about, although I think families definitely think about it, and it's not that patients don't think about it at all, they definitely think about it. It's just the physical risk that comes from seizures, right? And the biggest physical risk is the risk from dying from a seizure. That's something that's really, really important. And I think that we have to at least include in the calculation about whether or not it's important to go into a more aggressive treatment, whether or not there are risk factors for having a seizure be a lethal situation. And there are some risk factors that go with seizures that might tell you that you would be at higher risk, like having tonic-clonic seizures. You know, the old word wasn't grand mal, big bad for nothing. And even though sometimes the person that experiences a tonic-clonic seizure who's kind of out of it may not sort of have full recollection of exactly how bad it is, they'll certainly remember how bad they feel afterwards, and their loved ones usually can speak to how scary it is. Having long duration seizures is not a good thing, and the tendency to cluster or have one after the other also makes them much more dangerous. But also, and I think this is something that patients will definitely focus on because this is where it is, this is where you live, is quality of life. And different kinds of seizures might well affect your quality of life in different ways. What if you don't lose consciousness during a seizure? Well, if you don't lose consciousness at all and it doesn't affect your coordination, you might be allowed to drive, right? That's a pretty big thing in the United States. You don't have to worry as much about having it get you in an accident. You're not going to walk out into traffic in the middle of a seizure if you don't have a loss of consciousness. So a person isn't going to value that kind of a seizure the exact same as a tonic-clonic seizure. And a person could be having one kind and feel very differently about moving on towards surgery than if they're having another kind, right? Finally, the patient experience is going to make a difference too. And this is something that I think that doctors, including myself, just have a heck of a time with. One of the things that we consider after surgery, at least the older classification system for how well a person has done after surgery is called the Engel classification for seizure control. And the class 1 outcome was if people had no seizures after surgery, right? So seizure-free after surgery. But there were various gradations of that. And it sort of said, well, maybe it's still seizure-free if a person only has their aura after surgery because if you only have your aura, then you don't lose consciousness and you'd be able to drive, and that seems like you'd have a great quality of life. And so for years, people were sort of told, look, you had a great outcome. You still have auras, but you don't have seizures anymore, so this is super. And in fact, it did probably reduce the risk for seizures quite a bit. But when neuropsychologists did quality of life surveys in folks, they found that actually people who had auras continued after seizure surgery had quality of life that looked a lot more like the people that continued having seizures rather than the people that were completely seizure-free. So even though doctors were sort of saying, look, you're seizure-free, you're doing great, patients were saying, I'm not so sure, I don't really like what I've got left. How predictable seizures are might change how you feel about it, right? If you have a really long aura before the seizure, that might make it more predictable. You could make yourself safer. Seizures that are reflex seizures or in response that only occur in a certain setting might make you want to sort of say it's more predictable so it's not so bad. And finally, nocturnal seizures, where they only occur during sleep, might be so predictable that it would be something that a person would say, well, I can still drive, right? Because I can go swimming. I don't have to worry about having drowning during swimming because I only have them when I'm asleep. And I guess the way I would look at that is nocturnal seizures would make the quality of life much better, but you have to still consider that there's a significant seizure risk because especially if they're tonic-clonic seizures at night or if they tend to cluster at night, you still have the risk factor from the bad physical things happening. And you have to balance that in the whole equation. So in answering the question, it's a lot more than just sort of saying, do I have no seizures, no side effects? It extends to what kind of seizures, how are the seizures affecting my life? And are my seizures bad enough to consider surgery? Most people achieve seizure control with medical treatment, but a lot don't. And if you don't, it's not just the presence or absence of seizures, it's also these other considerations. So what do we do if it's not good enough? If you decide, you know what, for me it's just not good enough. And I think that I only want to mention the very first steps in the evaluation for surgery. And those two steps are inpatient video EEG monitoring, where you have the seizures recorded with EEG and video, and MRI. And those two are very important because EEG sort of establishes the functional activity of the brain and shows where the seizures are most likely coming from. And the MRI can show what the cause underlying the seizures might be. And those two things give you the information to know how likely it is that surgery would be able to help you with stopping the seizures. Okay. So to conclude, again, a lot of people are going to have ongoing seizures. People are going to feel very differently about whether or not they should move towards surgery. Some of the things that make a person consider whether or not they're a candidate for surgery would be the physical risks associated with their seizures and the loss of quality of life from the seizures, as well as from the medicine. If there's an inkling that surgery might be a good option, it's a good idea to go through the initial evaluation, because the initial evaluation can tell you how likely it is that surgery can help. And when you have all that information together, then you can sort of put it all together and balance whether for you or for your child it makes sense to move towards surgery. Thanks.
Found my glasses. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Curtis Augusti. He's the Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at the University of California, San Francisco at Benioff's Children's Hospital, and he's going to talk to us about new approaches to surgery.
Thank you. Well, I think the organizing committee thought it's a really great idea to have me talk about the opening of your skull and cutting out of big chunks of brain right after lunch. But I found out that the slides that had pictures of the brain were removed for editorial purposes. So I thought, man, how am I going to impress these people without pictures of the brain? But I joke about it. But what we're talking about here is what I do every day, and these are very large procedures, and in many ways, and in the pictures we're going to show you, it's kind of barbaric. It's just an abomination. And it goes against everything that we learn when we're training to be epilepsy surgeons. We're trying to protect brain, and here we are going in there, exposing lots of tissue and removing anatomy. It goes against everything innate to us. And so what I want to talk about today is ways that we're moving past that, and how the horizon looks and how the landscape is changing for epilepsy surgery. So what we do now for treating epilepsy is typically open surgery. There are many different ways to do this. And what you're left with sometimes are very disfiguring things. And you heard Lisa and Evan's story about how aggressive and how invasive and how frankly frightening this experience can be. And I work with kids all the time, and it's a big ordeal for families and for kids to go through such a thing. And how can we avoid things like this? And this is often what my patients are left with. They do great, and we help a lot of kids, and we cure a lot of epilepsy. But is there a way to do it without being quite so invasive? So something that we're employing already, something that's already in my practice, is a gamma knife. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I kind of walk you through your gamma knife day. It's something that happens in one day. You come in the morning, and you have this head frame placed on your head. It touches your head in 4 points, so it's fixated in the skull. Get an MRI, and we can see that frame on the MRI pictures. And the patient's placed in this machine. While they're being ready for the machine, we are taking the images, the MRI images, and using a computer program to generate a treatment field. The patient is wheeled into the machine. Their head is placed into kind of a helmet, and in the helmet are very small columns of cobalt, which is a radiation source. And not all of them are firing at the same time, just a certain sequence of them to generate a target field, a three-dimensional target field. And these beams meet in the middle at your target. This is what the pictures look like, and from the middle picture you can see yellow and green lines. That's our treatment field. But what this software and what these programs allow us to do is not only target the bad, or the place that we think the epilepsy is coming from, but also shield and protect the good. So on the left-hand side, you see some purple lines. We've told this computer program, whatever you do not allow any radiation to come to these structures. So we're able to kind of pinpoint and precisely deliver this treatment. And depending on who you ask and what literature you read, the seizure control rates are, there's a bit of a variability, but what I tend to quote from my patients is somewhere between 65 and 85% of patients with temporal lobe epilepsy who get gamma knife for this disorder are going to have seizure control. Another type of epilepsy that I treat very frequently are hypothalamic hamartomas. It's very, very small lesion. You can barely see it on this scan, but these are really deep-seated lesions. And the classic story of a patient with a hypothalamic hamartoma is one of either precocious puberty or behavioral problems and something called gelastic seizures, where they're inappropriately laughing. And they can have weight gain and all these things that kids can struggle with in very subtle ways, and then they go undiagnosed for many, many years. When we finally find the lesion, however, this is right in the center of the brain. This is not a very hospitable place to be operating. And so my stomach always sinks when I meet with a lot of families who have hypothalamic hamartomas, because this is a very daunting surgical task. And so gamma knife is a way to approach that without an actual knife. And so similarly, we're able to define our anatomy for treatment and also define anatomy for protection. And seizure control rates are in the order of 60% for patients with this disorder. The next is laser ablation, and it's also now currently being employed. It is currently the thing that has the most buzz amongst all adult and pediatric epilepsy surgery surgeons. And what it is instead of actually doing a full-on craniotomy and a very large exposure, we're using a very small fiber with a laser at the end. You can see it on the right here. And it's delivered with a little cannula that has a coolant around it to protect the structures on the way down. And everything is controlled by a panel on a mobile computer system that you see there. This is FDA approved for laser ablation in the brain. A head frame is typically placed that's MRI compatible, and MRI is obtained, and those pictures with the head frame in place are used to target, to create our target lesion. And the patient is brought back to a procedural room or an OR, and a little twist drill is placed on the scalp and skull to hold this laser in place. They're brought back to the MRI, and in real time we watch the ablation happening, and I'm going to show you some pictures as well. Afterwards we get a new MRI, and the head frame is removed, and it's, again, a one-day thing, kind of like the gamma knife, a one-day thing, and the patient typically spends the night or goes home the next day. We at UCSF have many different ways that we deliver these fibers, depending on where the lesion is. And on the left is this device called the ClearPoint Smart Frame. It allows us to get very, very precise locations deep down in the brain. A more traditional frame is called the Lexel, which is the same kind of Lexel that we use for the gamma knife. There are also frameless techniques. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, we use something in the operating room called neuronavigation. And what I'm holding in my hand is a little wand that has 4 little gray balls in them. And there's a camera that sees those gray balls. As I'm moving this wand in three-dimensional space, all those pictures on the TV screen are moving with me. So I know where I am at all times. If you have a target on an MRI, and you can see it on that MRI, and I place my wand right where I need to, I can find my spot, and I don't need a frame for that purpose. This is just the machine that sees the wand. And this is what holds the fiber in place. Now, this is very, very different, obviously, than that first slide I showed you, where I had a patient who had to have a large craniotomy. Little nick incision in the scalp, at the end of which we just twist it out and place a little stitch or not. There's some folks that don't even put a little stitch. No shaving of the hair, nothing disfiguring. And as I mentioned, patients go home either the next day or sometimes the same day. This fiber is actually placed into the target, floated down under MRI guidance so you know where you are at all time. In this case, this is a case of a hypothalamic hamartoma down deep at the very tip of the fiber. What this technology allows you to do is up on the upper right-hand side, I place some little red X's on kind of boundaries. These are thermal safeguards. Lasers firing, the tissue's heating. I'm telling this device and this software, do not allow the heat to get past a certain amount in this area, because beyond that is important stuff. So the MRI allows us to actually watch in real time the heating up of the tissue. And the software on the far right-hand side, is quantifying approximately how much tissue have you actually ablated. Okay, and this, again, is all done through a little tiny twist drill hole in the skull. And then we get a post-op MRI afterwards, and so in this case we had a really nice result where we were able to ablate this hematoma from within. And as of kind of the middle of last month, over 700 cases have been done. Now, this technology is not just specifically for epilepsy, and so this large table of numbers is all comers, so tumors, epilepsy, vascular lesions. But quite a lot of work has been done. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of buzz about this. It's very early. We're not going to know the very long-term results for quite some time, but I can tell you that the preliminary results are very, very encouraging. For temporal lobe epilepsy, a very recent publication showed that in their experience, 77% of patients are seizure-free with this technique. Another series out of Texas, 86% of hypothalamic hamartoma patients are seizure-free. Now, these are early. Sometimes when you have these early, I want to be the first to publish series, these are the best. You know, they're kind of selecting out to get the best outcomes. But I think that the real numbers are going to be in this neighborhood, and we're all very excited about this technique. So the next few things, this one's kind of on the horizon and just about to branch out, and the next few things are kind of, again, on the horizon, and we hope will be available soon. So responsive stimulation, or the NeuroPace device, which I actually was able to see outside, is a device that it's kind of like a babysitter, all right? And it's sitting and it's waiting for a seizure to happen. And when that spot in the brain cries out for attention, it soothes that spot, okay? The way it works is there's a stimulator that's placed, actually seated in the skull on this cartoon here, and connected to it are up to 2 strips, or 2 depth electrodes, 2 electrodes. And these are for patients who have had, so far, the indications are, failed 2 meds, have had greater than 3 seizures per month, and have had at least one seizure focus visible on MRI, up to 2 seizure focus foci visible on MRI. So when you have these foci in mind, you can place your depth electrode, you can place your strip electrode over them, and connect them to the stimulator. And what they're doing is they're waiting. They're waiting for these seizures to happen, and when they do occur, they can stimulate and kind of halt the seizure in its tracks. And so this is very different in thinking, the way that we have been thinking of finding that focus, that seizure focus, and going after it. This is a means of locating it, yes, but also just leaving it in place, and instead of removing it, just kind of modulating it. And this recent publication showed that there was a 21% reduction in seizures compared to their control group. This is the device it's fitting. This is actually my hand. So it fits in my hand, but it's right now the first iteration of it, and we pediatric specialists are hoping that smaller iterations are available. But there's a whole category of patients who are not candidates for resection. When we do our work, when Paul and I are working up patients and we're looking for bad brain and good brain, we're going to go and remove that bad brain. We're going to leave the good brain. But what if they're overlapping and we can't take that good brain out? Well, this is a means of potentially modulating the tissue in place without removing it. Deep brain stimulation, I'm actually really not going to go into much detail. I believe Dr. Fisher is going to talk more about it. I just mean to say that there are devices that will be coming down the pike where we can place stimulators in different nuclei of the brain, collections of specialized nuclei, neurons in the brain, and these are just some of the targets that will be potentials for deep brain stimulation to control epilepsy in patients. Focal cerebral cooling, they utilize a device called a Peltier device that delivers basically a focal spot of cool temperature to the surface of the brain in a way that's somewhat similar to the way the NeuroPace is working, where you have to know where those seizures are coming from, and when that spot is identified, you can cool it and stop a seizure in its tracks. These are pretty thin. These are, again, the first iterations. They can be very, very small. That's 1 on a dime, and they can get very, very cold. And this is a bit further down the line. And the last thing I'll talk about is it's very experimental in this, at this stage in the game. In rat models, they are able to show that in the setting of continuous EEG, when you induce a seizure pharmacologically in rats, you can pulse their brains with some ultrasound and either interrupt their seizures or stop them, and the ultimate goal being we can potentially use this in a way that modulates brain like our NeuroPace and Peltier devices, or to actually lesion targets of seizure foci. So this is my whole bag of tricks as it's developing. You can see the theme being we're moving away from this really invasive approach to treating patients, moving more towards being more conservative. We're going to stop using terms like excision and resection. And by the end of my career, we're going to be using words like modulation much more frequently. There's even possibly a time where we're going to look back and say, my God, what were we doing? And we wouldn't have to do open surgery, and that would be a good thing. So thank you.
Well, these are really exciting times we live in. I have to admit something. I was first involved in epilepsy surgery some 32, 33 years ago, probably before you were born. And we used CAT scans to figure out where to use those were our guides, and we used these kind of frames during intraoperatively. We didn't have subdurals, we didn't have any of that stuff. So I just look very young, but I've been around for a while. Anyway, we're coming more to all the new devices and the exciting things that are happening in epilepsy today. We have with us, very luckily, Dr. Robert Fisher from Stanford University, and he's going to talk to us about the pipeline and all the other new devices coming down for epilepsy therapy.
Thank you. If we take a step back for the moment and ask, what are the ways we can treat epilepsy? Medications are probably 95% of it practically. If you have a place in the brain where your seizures originate and it can be safely removed, then surgery may be curative. And as you have heard, there are new methods, but we're not ready to discourage or give up on the usual method of epilepsy surgery, which is time-honored. We just have additional alternatives. You can do ketogenic diet. It's more for kids, but adults use modified Atkins, and that's sometimes helpful. There are occasional other treatments that are not so evidence-based, like biofeedback, but some people might say they help, or relaxation methods, or complementary medicines. And do tell your doctors when you're taking complementary medicines, because sometimes they're interactive with other treatments, and we learn that we only find out about them about half the time. But increasingly, if your meds don't work, you're not a candidate for a type of curative surgery, the diet isn't for you, then devices are going to become an increasingly big thing. And there are devices that are like EEGs or MRIs that we use to diagnose epilepsy, and then there are devices that are therapeutic, and there are devices that are kind of halfway between diagnostic and therapeutic. So that's the big picture that I think of when I see someone in clinic who's having seizures that aren't responding to medications. What are some other alternative directions in which to go? So I've been asked to reprise my talk of a couple of days ago at the pipeline for the Family Day. So I will do that. It won't be precisely the same talk, but apologies to those who sat through the first talk because it will be very overlapping and similar. I should let you know that I have conflicts of interest, which means that I consult with some of these companies that make the devices that we're talking about. So you should know that. That's part of disclosure. There are these different systems. I'll highlight a few, and then I think I'll try to go through pretty quickly to make up a little bit of the time, but also to leave time for questions. The first thing is seizure alert or prediction devices. One of these is the watch that you've heard about. There are a couple of different kinds of watches that pick up shaking from seizures. And there was a device written by just a very cute 13-year-old kid and his dad last night that we heard about in the Shark Tank competition, which uses the smartphone itself, which has an accelerator built in that can pick up shaking and signal a seizure. So we have ways, if you, for example, have a child or a loved one who's having a seizure, and you can't sleep at night because you're afraid they're going to have a seizure in their bed and you won't know about it, you can put one of these shake devices on them, one of the watches, one of the iPhone or Android smartphone programs. There's even one that you can attach to your bed that will pick up the bed shaking. Probably a little bit better than, say, baby monitors just to hear the shaking, but some people use that as well. And this can be an alert device, so you can go in and give help to people when they're having the seizures. The Cyberonics, which makes the vagus nerve stimulator, is coming out with a chest patch that will pick up shaking and changes in the pulse rate. You'd wear it around your chest mostly at night, and Lori Groven of Cyberonics talked about it in the conference here. One of the problems with the shake detectors is they don't pick up the smaller seizures, the complex partial seizures, and those can have some consequences as well. For example, you might walk down a flight of stairs without realizing it or out into traffic. But there's no shaking involved with those unless they become generalized tonic-clonic seizures. So I was enthused to learn that there's an old measurement that is newly applied to epilepsy called the electrodermal response, the EDR. And most of you will say, never heard of it. But you have, because it used to be called the galvanic skin response, which was the basis of the lie detector test. It just picks up a change in skin conductance, skin resistance, in other words, that happens when you're getting kind of nervous and getting a little bit sweaty about things. Now, this device won't do lie detection, but it turns out that it does show increases in the EDR, the electrodermal response, with at least some tonic-clonic, which is grand mal seizures, and also some complex partial seizures, which do not show up on, say, the smartwatch for shake detection. So this could be an interesting advance, and I just bought 6 of these, and we're starting to test them out and see if it holds water, but it could be interesting. It's possible to measure the muscle, to put a patch on the muscle called a surface EMG, and to detect the shaking from the muscle without the brain itself having to be monitored. Again, that will just pick up fairly big seizures. This is another seizure that can be applied, another seizure measuring device that can be applied to children at night. It's heart rate based, and it picks up heart rate changes that happen during seizures. So you can see that we're getting a lot of different devices that can notify of seizures once a seizure is underway. Of course, it would be even better if you could predict a seizure before it started. I mean, how different would your life be if you could remove the uncertainty from when a seizure was going to occur? If you could have a device that would tell you you're in the clear for the next hour, you're not likely to have a seizure, or alternatively, you're at high risk for having a seizure, don't go out. Stay home, stay safe. Well, it turns out that this kind of science fiction sounding occurrence is potentially coming to pass. There exists a device which is invasive because you can't yet paste it just on the skin, you have to slip it under the bone, not into the brain, but between bone and brain. And then you run a connection to a pacemaker, rather like the vagus nerve stimulator, all under the skin, and that constantly monitors your EEG pattern and gives a signal when it looks like a seizure is likely to occur in the next minutes to hour. It broadcasts it to a belt pager, which turns red, shows a red color when you're in danger of a seizure coming up. And if it's showing blue, I guess they did red and blue rather than red and green because 6% of American males are red-green colorblind. So it shows blue if you're in the clear. And here's how that device looks. And this looks like a complicated graph, but it really isn't. It's one patient, one person, and every line is a day. So you can see day after day the periods that are blue or red, and white is indeterminate. The machine's not sure. And the 3 red arrows, the one at the bottom is just a legend marker. The 3 arrows show where there really were seizures, and they all fall in a period when the red warning was on. But you also see there are 4 or 5 other red warnings that didn't turn into seizures. Maybe those were seizures that were about to happen but didn't fully develop, but we're not sure about that. So, of course, when you publish a paper, and this is not my paper, this is a paper from the study that was done in Australia on this and published in the Lancet Neurology, you always publish your best patient, prettiest picture. So I think probably they didn't all work this well, but about 6 of them out of 13 or so did work that well. So how different will this be if we can tell when our next seizure is going to occur and get safe? The company that developed this technology went out of business. Having a good idea and having a good business plan are not the same thing in this line of work. But the technology was acquired by Cyberonics, that's publicly known now, and I hope that they will carry it forward to develop not a seizure detector that notifies after the fact, but a seizure predictor that talks to us before a seizure occurs. When we have that, we'll be able to not only ask you to get yourself safe, but maybe it will be a time when we could deliver a stimulation to the devices that you just heard about, or maybe you can spray something in your nose or take some treatment that will stop the seizures. So let me move much more quickly now through the rest. Adherence, which used to be compliance monitors. I'm not preaching or complaining, but it's really hard to remember to take your pills properly, especially if you have to take them 3 or 4 times per day, and especially if there are different pills you have to take at different times. So sticking to the regimen the way it's supposed to be done is called adherence. It used to be called compliance. And we're getting better at tracking that. So there are pill boxes, and I recommend ordinary pill boxes for everyone, but there are pill boxes which will keep track of each time they're open for you to take the pills. It's useful to the doctors, but people tend not to want to spend money on a box that's designed to spy on them. So probably no one in this room is using the electronic pill box. There are methods developed now that can implant chips under your skin that will beam your blood levels continuously to a readout device. And then there are pills, like those little green pills on the right, that have tiny little radio transmitters in them that when it hits the stomach acid and the pill dissolves and that transmitter gets to that acidic pH, it broadcasts a message, "I've been eaten," to some other. So if you think the government is spying on you, wait until your own pills are spying on you. I think that one of the biggest changes in the way we will manage patients in the future will involve better information. My problem as a clinician is that I don't get good information. You try. Don't raise your hands, but how many of you really do a good job of keeping a seizure diary? And she's probably not typical for for this. So you heard about better ways of doing it, and there are 3 diaries being used right now. Seizure Tracker. I guess I should have said Rob and Lisa Moss. Forgive me for that. My Epilepsy Diary, which was the Epilepsy Therapy Project Diary, and Patients Like Me has a diary, although not so specialized to epilepsy. Plus, others are being developed. It'd kind of be nice if there were only one, it'd be simpler. But the important thing is to make it as easy as possible for you to keep track of your seizures and report them. So I see this possible future, which I based on a cartoon by T. McCracken. We're going to run a few tests to pin down the cause of your seizures. I can see that people will not have to write in a paper book. They will not have to call up an application on their smartphone and punch a button, but they'll have some sort of biosensor that will signal when they have a seizure automatically to a recorder up in the cloud on the internet. And of course, there are always going to be privacy concerns and reliability concerns that we have to worry about when you do this. So it always has to be in consideration when we make those systems. And therefore, there'd be automatic seizure tracking. You wouldn't have to keep a log. There'd also be some sort of automatic tracking of how and when you're taking your pills and what your blood or body levels are. For example, I'm interested in using saliva lately to track levels of drugs. To get that side of the equation in, and then you would get feedback from this internet cloud on what to do about the situation that you're in. It would not only be better information, but what we need is a way to get you all information to keep you or your kids from having seizures before they have them, to keep them from having toxicity. How stupid is it of us to wait until you have a seizure and then get a drug level and then adjust something? Isn't there a way we can get ahead of this curve and prevent those seizures from happening? There'll be new ways of drug delivery. 3 companies that I know of are developing nasal sprays to use if you're having a cluster of seizures. Right now, well, you heard earlier from Dr. Cloyd, who's been a pioneer in this area. Right now, we have rectal diastat, but that's obviously not the most convenient or suitable method to use in a given circumstance. Nose sprays are there, and I think they will come into play, but they're not easy because there's just barely enough surface area in the nostrils to get the stuff in time. Now, we smoke a lot of substances here in San Francisco, and one of them soon may be your seizure medicine. There are 2 companies that are working to inhale drugs, and the lungs are a big surface area that gets to the bloodstream very quickly. So this is different from spraying it in your nose, where it has to be absorbed in your nostrils. We're talking about someone breathing it in. And that's a novel new technique, and I'm hopeful that that will be able to deliver drug quickly. When would you use this? Well, some people get auras, which are little seizures that are warnings. And if you pop an Ativan or a lorazepam or a Klonopin, maybe it will help, but most of the time it doesn't get into your system fast enough. So we hope that the nasal spray or the inhaled sprays may make a difference here. You'll see at some points in the future putting drugs directly into the brain. It's not something that most of you would have done, but occasionally in very severe circumstances, this technology is going to be developed. It will just drip drugs in through a pump directly to the brain. I won't repeat too much from the last 2 items because you've heard a bit about them already, but there's a category called focal energy, 3 things that were mentioned, plus the vagus nerve stimulation itself. And the 3 things were the laser, the focused radiation, and the focused ultrasound. You all, I think, know a bit about the vagus nerve stimulator, which is I almost said it's the only approved neurostimulation, but I have to change that because recently the NeuroPace responsive neurostimulation is also approved in the US, and the deep brain thalamic stimulation is approved in over 30 countries around the world, and hopefully will soon be approved in the US. So we have these new methods of stimulation. The vagus nerve stimulator is about to come out with a new model, which is being tested now, that not only cycles with stimulation, say every 5 minutes as you program it, but automatically stimulates if it senses a heart rate increase with your seizure. So that may add a little effectiveness to people who have benefit, like the ones who think swiping the magnet helps. This is like an automatic magnet swipe built on your heart rate. And then I'm happy to answer questions about the neurostimulation protocols. Just please be clear that there are these 2 flavors that we have now. One is the responsive neurostimulation, which is sponsored by NeuroPace. That is the one that had the implantation in the skull of the box. And in order to do that, you have to know where your seizures come from, because you have to put 1 or 2 wires over the seizure focus, so you have to know where they are. And then it senses the seizure and counter shocks. I think babysitter was the phrase that was used. It's probably appropriate. Whereas the other neurostimulation protocol is kind of like the vagus nerve stimulation in that it just stimulates ongoing. It's not sensing. And for that one, you don't have to know where your seizures come from in the brain. So I think these two different stimulation technologies are complementary, but right now in the United States, only the NeuroPace responsive stimulation is available. For example, in Canada, the other one is available. So I think I'll stop now, and I believe we probably have some questions and comments. And may I, since I'm standing at the podium, take the opportunity to ask the first question of one of my panelists? Would you say there's no more value to temporal lobectomy, or were you just talking about what's next?
No, it's still my favorite surgery to do. No, you know, I guess when I was putting my slides together, I probably should have assured my surgical colleagues that we are not going out of business anytime soon. There's always, I think for a very long time, there's going to be a role for open cranial surgery until the other techniques we've had experience with and we can advocate for them and we can attest to their safety and their efficacy and all those kinds of things. We're still going to be using those techniques. It's just that, for example, the same group that published the preliminary series on the laser ablation technique for temporal lobe epilepsy, one of the associated findings that they were looking at was neuropsychologic testing for these patients. And there's a lot of lateral temporal lobe cortex that is taken away. Sorry. Is this on still?
Microphone not working.
Yeah, sorry.
Working.
For a temporal lobectomy, a standard temporal lobectomy, a lot of that tissue goes away. For ablation, it's left in place. And so we are going to start to tease out which patients are appropriate for which techniques, and are we really fully understanding the cost of some of the big open cranial surgeries. But I think in terms of our experience as practitioners and being honest with our families and our patients about what do we expect for these treatments, we just have so much vastly more experience with the open procedures that I think for a long time we're still going to rely on those. And only when it's proven to us to be more efficacious and safer would we start to really fully shift wholesale as a group. But no, it's not going away for a while.
All right, thank you. And in talking about open craniotomies, I want to introduce somebody else who's joined our panel, and she spoke a little this morning, but for those of you who aren't here, this is Christina Bertoldi. Did I say your name right? And she is a young lady who underwent successful surgery for her epilepsy, and I'd just like her to speak for a few minutes on her experience, how she decided to have surgery, what happened, and how she is now.
Originally, is this on? Okay. Originally, I got misdiagnosed with neurocysticercosis, and I got told I was inoperable and I wouldn't be able to have surgery. But then I switched from pediatric neurology to adult neurology, then found out that it's not that. It was actually a tumor, and it was operable. So it was November of my freshman year of college. Then I got told I had to have surgery right away to get removed to see what kind of tumor it was. So I was talking to my parents and figuring it out, and I was either going to take the semester off and do it then or wait, and I decided to wait because I didn't want to fall behind in school. So I did it in 2 weeks after I got out of school, after finals. I went to Stanford. I had my surgery. I had one surgery, and I had the map put on my head to see what kind of seizures I was having and to map out where they were going to go through and everything. And then a week later, I had they cut open my brain and pulled it out and got the area around it and everything. And
Beautifully put. Go ahead. That's what happens.
And then 3 days later, my doctor was like, okay, you can go home now. And I was like, okay. My mom didn't like it, but we did.
And now?
And now it's been 4 years, seizure-free. I had one seizure a couple months after my surgery, but nothing since that I know of, so, which is really good.
So you're glad you did it?
Yes, definitely glad.
So it works.
Yeah.
And I believe we have some people at the podium, at the microphone.
Yeah, so I guess my question is mostly for Dr. Garcia. And the question is kind of, in a world where there has been a published randomized control study documenting the efficacy of the ketogenic diet, in a world where the international medical guidelines for administering the ketogenic diet, in a consensus statement, the physicians all agree that a ketogenic diet should be strongly considered after the failure of 2 or 3 medications. In a world where there are thousands and thousands of cases, anecdotal evidence of the efficacy of the ketogenic diet, I wonder how you can give a talk entitled "When Seizures Don't Respond to Medications" and not even read a syllable of diet therapy.
As I pass the microphone to Dr. Garcia to answer, I'd like to indicate that for those of you who don't know, we're honored to have the famous Hollywood director Jim Abrams and the founder of the Charlie Foundation here at the mic.
Thanks. And that's actually an absolutely great question. I'll answer this in 2 parts. And one is, I'll start off by saying that the decision analysis would be different for children than for adults for the most part, because the ketogenic diet is powerfully effective for children and almost certainly less so for adults, although, as Dr. Fisher pointed out, dietary treatments for adults can certainly be as effective as a lot of different medicines. The maybe less stringent kind of dietary treatments. So you're exactly right. The main reason I reference surgery in this is that's what I was asked to do. But you're right. This would apply. The decision analysis would apply to treatments like the ketogenic diet or to medical cannabis equally. It's the same kind of thought process. You try some of the standard medication. You don't have to try very many before you know if the seizures are going to come under complete control. If the seizures aren't under complete control, and that's sort of complete control in the eye of the beholder, the person who's experiencing the seizures, the person who's experiencing the seizure medicine side effects, if things are not satisfactory, one really should be looking for better treatments. And especially in children, the ketogenic diet can be a knockout, and it should be high on the list of things to be considered. There definitely are people for whom the ketogenic diet should be the first consideration before considering an operation.
Christina?
This question is related to the gamma knife surgery. Are there risks in damaging the healthy tissue surrounding the foci when you're performing this surgery?
That's kind of where the planning comes into play. I downplayed how long it takes to actually generate these target plans, the treatment plans, but there's a lot of hemming and hawing, and it's actually a several-person team who huddles around the screen and says, "But what about this?" And then the other person's saying, "Well, we got to get this treated," back and forth. And it's only when we are all satisfied, and we're satisfied that we're not hurting eloquent or important tissue, that we proceed. So a lot of it comes down to us planning out how do we shield good things. I think it's totally possible. It's just you run the risk of not being as efficacious with your treatment. When I counsel my families, I also tell them that sometimes we can see immediate results, but the more likely story is that it's going to be quite some time before we see the end result. And so during that waiting game, this frustrating waiting game, you're wondering, did you not treat it enough? Is it really going to work? And it doesn't really pan out for almost a year sometimes, what we got. And so that's going on in our heads as well as we're walking that fine line between being efficacious and being safe. So.
And what is the recovery time in comparison, if you were to compare the Gamma Knife to Visual Ace in comparison to a resective surgery?
Well, the Gamma Knife and the Visual Ace should be in their own category compared to open cranial surgery. Most of my standard craniotomies go home in about 3-4 days, but they're still home with a wound, and they're still sore, and their hair has to grow back, so there's the psychological component of things, and so they're not totally back to normal and feeling normal for quite some time, weeks, versus Gamma Knife and Visual Ace. Those are typically they're one-day treatments. The Gamma Knives always go home the same day. Visual Ace, because it's so new and because I work with kids, we're still getting comfortable ourselves, less about the patients. It's more we don't want to hurt anybody, so we end up letting them go the next day. And as far as we can tell, and any of these kids are telling us what they can feel, it's just a little nick incision, and they barely feel it by the time they wake up from their anesthesia, because the kids do it under anesthesia. The adults tend to be awake for the Gamma Knife and asleep for the Visual Ace. Little nick incisions, they're not very sore, and the Gamma Knife is just 4 points of fixation, and those are off by the time the kids wake up. So in terms of pain and recovery, really not much of an element of that for recovery for Gamma Knife and Visual Ace.
Well, Lisa, how long did it take Evan to recover from his open craniotomy?
It did take Evan quite a while to recover, but I do have to stress that the tumors that were being removed were very close to the motor strip, and so there were a lot of concerns going in that there would be damage to the motor strip. The surgeon was able to not hit the motor strip, but because they were working so close, we knew that there would be increased physical therapy needed. So it really took probably 6 months to get close. By 9 months, when he was rock climbing, he was really back to where he was. But he was he was in preschool at the time. He had the surgery in November, pretty much all of November. We were at the hospital, and then it was he was out of school all of December, all of January, and most of February as well, before he even went back to preschool, but still continued PT for 3 days a week for the next few months. So it was a different recovery. But I also would say the surgery is different also than what was being discussed, because this isn't a surgery where you go in and then 3 days later you go home. This was a series of 3 surgeries. So the first surgery was invasive monitoring for a week. The second surgery was a resection, so they removed part of the bad tissue, and they replaced the monitoring. And then the third surgery was to remove additional tissue and close them up. So, and those surgeries were spaced about a week apart. So it's it's probably one of the most intense ways to do brain surgery. So.
And what about you, Christine? And when did you feel you were recovered?
Once I actually got my pain under control, I was fine at home with my family, because I had my family and my friends and the support and all their love to help me. But I didn't like going outside the house until I had my hair back. I was very self-conscious. I had a lot of bad experiences going out with no hair. So I kind of just only went out when I needed to, until my mom and dad got me a wig to make me feel a little bit better. So then I was better after that. But once I went back to school in August, I always had a hat on, or I was wearing my wig. I never had my head not covered, because I have a huge scar on my head, and I don't want people staring. And so, but I'd say a couple weeks, once I got the pain under control, I felt like myself. But then I felt like my 100% self once I actually had my hair back. So that probably like 6 months.
Fair enough. Question?
One of the challenges for people, some of the challenges with people who have epilepsy and their families are the mood issues, the depression, the sleep issues that go along with having epilepsy or an epilepsy disorder disease. There was some discussion on Thursday that the transgeminal nerve stimulation approach or device, patients showed an increase in mood even prior to a reduction in seizures. Is that also true with the deep brain stimulator or the other nerve stimulator, the trigeminal?
Trigeminal.
Yeah.
Yeah, the trigeminal nerve is a nerve that covers sensation to the face. The trigeminal nerve stimulation, which is not an approved treatment yet, is kind of like vagus nerve stimulation, except the vagus nerve stimulator is implanted, so it takes an operation, whereas the trigeminal nerve stimulator being developed by a team down at UCLA just puts a patch on the nerve near the eye, a branch of the trigeminal nerve, and people will have that on for a couple hours a day, receiving the stimulation. It's in preliminary trials. It hasn't had the definitive trials yet, and it's certainly not approved, but it's looking like it might be effective for improving depression and also for improving epilepsy or improving seizure frequency. And you said something that is so important, which is that we worry a lot about seizures and counting seizures, but what seems to affect some people's lives even more than the seizure count is what we call the comorbidities of epilepsy. And the most important of those, in my opinion, is whether or not someone's happy or depressed. And then you've got the whole question, are they driving or not driving? Is there a lot of anxiety? There are all these other things that really play on the quality of life. So epilepsy is not just seizures, and treating epilepsy is not just getting the seizure count down.
Thank you for saying that, because that's really one of the challenges of being a family member of a person with epilepsy. They have the fear, but so do you. You have the stress and the worry, and am I doing the right things? Am I finding the right treatment? But are they also going to be okay? Are they in a good frame of mind to be compliant with their medication? Are they depressed, or are they hopeful about their future or their present?
Thank you. Yes?
Hi, my name is Megan Kennedy, and I'm an adult with epilepsy. And like you, I was diagnosed November of my freshman year in college, so maybe we need to do a study about that next, hey? But actually, I have a comment versus a question, and it ties in not just what y'all have been talking about, but as well as some of the earlier panelists. And that is in regards to the fact that, like many people with epilepsy, I had my down times. In fact, I was considering brain surgery at one point because I tried pretty much every first-gen AED that had been out there, and we did not have the devices that are available today. So I am so glad to see all of this out there, and to everyone listening here as well as on the internet, my thing is, first of all, do not give up. It took 12 years for me to find the right drug cocktail, and now I'm living life, and my quality of life is much better. Also, what was my turning point was going on a clinical trial. And even though my mom and my doctor were pushing me, it took me that little bit of saying, even though you're going on a clinical trial, no matter what you go on, even though it's been approved by the FDA, your body is different than anyone else's. So if that's what's holding you back, please get out there and consider doing that, because you're going to make life so much better, perhaps for yourself, but for so many others down the road. Thank you.
Thank you.
The question is for Dr. Garcia. No, actually, sorry. The surgeon's name. I guess I messed it up.
Dr. Gusty.
Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. So my question question relates to, can you describe your thought process as you're going through this decision chart, where you decide, open brain surgery, gamma knife, or visual-aids? And I guess second part of that question is, between the gamma knife and visual-aids, how do you decide between those two?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say that it's never a surgeon alone, or it shouldn't just be a surgeon alone. At a minimum, it's the surgeon and the patient. But in our cases, we are part of a team, and we eventually may arrive at a procedure, whether it's gamma knife or visual-aids or surgery, but arriving at that point has usually been weeks and months of workup and collaboration. Everybody's a bit different, and I wish it was just as easy as just like Plinko, you put the coin at the top and it kind of falls down into, open surgery. There's actually a lot of gray area, and there are sometimes options. And that's, again, where it comes back to the family and to the patients to say, well, of these options that are available to you, here are the pros and here are the cons. It's too bewildering, I think, to go through that long list, and I could then spend a whole nother hour on all the open cranial surgery that I do and different kinds, 1-step, 2-step, 3-step. It's this group, epilepsy patients, this group is so diverse, and it's unfair to that diverse group to try and cubbyhole. So it absolutely requires a very detailed review of their clinical history, their medications, what their EEGs look like, what their MRIs look like, potentially PET, MEG. All these things go into that equation, that formula, and then at the end of it is what generates the... So I wish there was an easy way to say, if it looks like this, you do surgery. If it looks like this, it's never like that. Before gamma knife and visual-aids, they're both kind of in their infancy. Maybe visual-aids more so than gamma knife. Gamma knife's been around a little bit longer. I tend to elect for those that are not easily surgically accessible, and I'm very worried. Like the surgeon's butterflies in the stomach start to fly a little bit and flutter a little bit. If we're working in a place that's very delicate and fragile, I might consider something relatively non-invasive. The problem with gamma knife is that you sometimes have to wait for the result, and the problem with visual-aids is that it's so new that we're still really learning what it's capable of. So.
I also read, just to follow up, every time I looked at the gamma knife, it was always about risk of radiation, risk of increased cancer type of activity down the road. I'm not sure how valid that is, but that's why I read against that. Yeah. And I've spoken to quite a few neurosurgeons before. My son has a lesion in the insular area, and it's right next to the all sorts of motor functions, like Lisa's, and it's like a spectrum of opinion. On one side, the doctor would say, well, at least I'm going to see what I'm cutting, and the other doctor would say, well, it's so delicate that it's almost inoperable, and if we won't consider that, then there has to be the low invasive type of a surgery. So I haven't been able to quite even put my finger on this because it seems to be quite spread out. It's a very risky tumor or dysplasia, but because nobody exactly knows what it is, it's people are having a hard time figuring out what's the best approach for it.
These are very tough decisions, and we work together and hopefully arrive at something that feels good for all of us.
All right, thank you.
Can I add something to that? We've gone through these same decisions, and we're actually looking at these decisions again, and we've been evaluated for both craniotomy and a visual-aid surgery, so we sort of are going through something very similar to you. And whenever we've been faced with these, we've always gone to second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth opinions, and it's not unusual in our family to seek out multiple experts' opinions, because ultimately we have to be the ones to make the decision, but we have to be well advised to do so. So, right. I can't say enough how important I think additional opinions are from very skilled individuals, and you make sure that you're choosing the right surgeons and hospitals to talk to that have the experience in the types of surgeries you're looking at.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I hope, I don't know if Dr. Fisher is the one who's best positioned to answer this or not. It's a question that relates to the potential ability and/or desirability of identifying a seizure focus. This is a case of complex partial seizures that generalize to grand mal. Some other factors of developmental disability and PTSD are also involved. After a number of medications and grand mal seizures that were secondarily generalized, there's now, for 3 years, complete seizure control on high-dose AEDs. The individual himself is dependent on others to administer medication, to monitor and interpret side effects. I'm wondering if the seizures are completely controlled, but there is sort of a risky side effect profile that can't really be effectively controlled by the individual or really informed by the individual. Is it advisable to try to determine the actual locus of the seizure? How possible is it to do that if the seizures are controlled by medication? Are there particular types of MRIs that are more sensitive than others? Thank you.
I wouldn't do anything at all risky to track down a seizure focus in someone who had good seizure control. As Dr. Garcia said, different people's definitions of good seizure control would vary,
Right.
but everybody would say someone who hasn't had a seizure for 3 years is in good control. So that would not be someone I would look to admit to an epilepsy monitoring unit, stop medicines to provoke seizures, and then pick them up again.
That's why I was asking specifically about MRI as opposed to, video EEG monitoring where you would want to see seizure activity.
Right.
Is there some imaging that's
you answer
becoming
that?
more sensitive?
Well, I don't think more sensitive imaging is what's necessary in this situation, because the one circumstance where you might possibly consider an operation in somebody like this is somebody who needs to have the operation because of what the underlying cause of the seizures is. So somebody that has a tumor growing, or somebody who has a blood vessel malformation that has the potential to burst. That would be the kind of thing where, well, maybe you would do the operation just because you needed it anyway, and maybe that would make the person's seizures easier to control with medicine. But as Dr. Fisher said, 100% is 100%. If you've got complete seizure control, you can't do better than that with an operation. And in fact, our operations rarely provide enough ability to control seizures so that a person doesn't have to take seizure medicine at all. And if we sort of start marketing epilepsy surgery as a good way to get off of medicine, we're going to have a lot of unsatisfied customers.
But you can get the medicine down a lot of times.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Garcia just answered my question. We all know that surgery and individuals are different, and I was wondering if there is a percentage of people who continue taking AEDs after surgery, and if so, if there comes a time when they can stop taking those AEDs safely.
It's a great question, and I think it varies a little bit probably in the adult and pediatric populations because we end up trying a lot harder for children. You can well imagine that folks that have had seizures for so long and finally gain seizure control are not so anxious to rock the boat when they come out after surgery not having seizures. So we don't have good controlled trials of comparing people that come off to people that don't come off, because people decide for themselves whether or not they're going to come off, and a lot of people decide, heck, I don't want to even try. I think the minority of people can come off medicine altogether. As Dr. Fisher has mentioned here, quite a few can have their medicines adjusted so that they are more comfortable with the medicine. But really, what seizure surgery is good at doing is changing so that the seizures can now be, quote, controlled, so that they aren't happening after the operation.
Thank you.
Well, okay, I want to thank the panel for two things: for presenting brilliant information and for keeping it on time. So anyway, let's give my panel a big round of applause. Thank you.
Ditto from me here, too. Thank you very much.